So this is the Testbeds for Future Tech channel. So looking at applying human-computer interaction frameworks to game worlds, or some of the things that we see in the game worlds that we play with and love. So in this panel, kind of go over some terminology and some ways of thinking about future tech. And this could be inside or outside of games, but we're using video games as a context for this and looking at different game mechanics through a human-computer interaction lens. Then we'll look at some real-world parallels, like some of the things that we see in games. Some of those technologies are existent now. They're not widespread, but they have been developed in labs or they're being worked on. And then we'll kind of brainstorm about what we can learn from examples and technologies in game worlds and how those can apply to designing things in the real world. And then we'll kind of, like, we can talk about whatever technologies you've seen in games that you like and say, all right, well, how does that fit into, like, if we wanted to translate that to the real world, like, what are some considerations that we would have to make to do that? But just a brief introduction of who I am. I'm Amy Lambeth. I'm a researcher at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, so pardon the y'alls. But I graduated from there with a bachelor's in computational media, and then I'm just about to finish my master's in HCI, but I work full-time at a lab that does some things like augmented and virtual reality, wearable computing, looking at the ethics of employing such technologies in the world. So I kind of do a mishmash of wherever they like to throw me, but I'm usually the user experience person on that team. So just some terminology to start off. So human-computer interaction, that's really just a framework that we use that's looking at how do we design technology with people in mind, because this is a symbiosis of, you know, a technology is great if it works, but it's not very helpful if people cannot use it or don't know how to use it or can't use it in the way that they need to achieve a goal. So that's what we're looking at, is how do we design technology with people in mind, because we're the ones building them, but we're the ones that, you know, ultimately use them and give them a purpose. And whatever purpose that is up to, like, that's an ethics discussion at another time. And then user experience is, what is it like to be the person that is using this technology? Like, if you walk, like, from the moment that you walk up to it, like, can you learn how to use it? Can you use it for the things that you want to use it for? Have you found new ways to use it? Like emergent behavior, that's where speedrunners come from. They've found ways to use the technology in ways that the designers didn't anticipate, but it branches off these other uses that we hadn't seen before. So some different principles that we think about when we're looking at those things are like, yeah, how usable is it? How easy is it to learn? Is it effective at what it's being designed for? How easy is it to use? Or the emotional impact, like, is it comfortable to use this thing, or does it, you know, invoke distress in the user or the people around them? And that goes to social acceptability. Like, it's great to have a technology, but part of what makes or breaks if it's widespread or successful is, will people use it because it exists in this socio-cultural lens? Like, could you designing things in the United States or the Western world is very different based on other parts of the world, even down to color theory and what that means. So those are all considerations that you have to make when you're designing technology for people or for specific people. So another term looking at is diegesis, which is actually from film study, which is saying, like, if we have something in media, does it exist within the world of the media, or does it exist outside of it? Like, is it the narrator, or is it something that, like, characters can hear? So, for example, if you're playing Breath of the Wild, can Link hear the music when the Guardians activate? Or is that something that just the player experiences? While at the same time, so that would be non-diegetic because the user can perceive it, but the occupants of the world can't. It's like that third-person omniscient point of view. And then diegetic is where yeah, it does belong to the world. So like if you have the Sheikah slate and you are using the magnet tool, then Link can presumably see the highlights of the objects that he's using the Sheikah slate on with the magnet tool. That's diegetic. That's in the world, he can perceive that. Otherwise, like, it would be a little strange if he couldn't see anything and he was somehow magically moving things, but, you know, ancient science magic. And that's where you can have some fun with breaking the fourth wall, because that, like, subverts those expectations of, like, if a character does acknowledge that, oh my God, what is this music that just started happening? Should we panic? Let's panic now, kind of thing. And then just a brief, like, setting of terminology for augmented and virtual reality. So augmented reality is the real world, but just with things overlaid on it. It's kind of like if you had like a clear whiteboard and you were just drawing stuff on it. That's kind of what AR is. You're looking at the real world. The only thing that's fabricated are the artifacts that are overlaid on top of it or situated in it. So it's a hybrid of the real and the digital. And then virtual reality is you put on the headset and everything is fabricated. A designer made all of those things. It is entirely virtual. So like those are just some things as we go through the discussion to keep in mind. Like that's what I mean when I'm talking about AR or VR or diegetics. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Or we can also do questions at the end, but I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Yes?
What's mixed reality?
Mixed reality is, I'm not 100% sure of how to define that, because like you can look at AR and VR as on a spectrum instead of separate things. So I would say mixed reality is between that area between augmented and virtual. It's just the amount of how much is fabricated and how much is real, because it's mixed instead of just like, I guess, separate overlays. It's the degree, it's a spectrum. That's the best way I can explain it. So a lot of the technologies that we see in games, there's some form or fashion that they are either being worked on or they already exist. And we pull inspiration from those, or we get inspiration from the games for that thing. So like Garrus's headset from Mass Effect is a diegetic piece of technology. Like he actively uses it, it's a defining feature of his character, and we can assume that other people in the world wear this item because nobody really calls out like, what is that thing on your head? So we have a parallel with Google Glass and other projection technologies. Like Google Glass did not get as widespread because, you know, it's kind of the first of those things to come out. There's a lot of things like, what is it useful for? Is it, you know, feasible to go out? There were issues with battery power. Like, you don't see Garrus jacked into the wall of the Normandy trying to charge up between missions because it has sufficient battery life, whereas Google Glass can only last you up to like 4 hours max if you're walking around, and then you would have to carry a backpack with a battery. What we have in Metal Gear, the codec, yeah, I have not actually played Metal Gear, but I know about the technology. So this is an implant, an audio implant. We're just shown the visual as the player, so that's non-diegetic. But Snake can communicate with other people through an implant in his head. We have, you know, cochlear implants, and we have hearing aids that have Bluetooth capability, but we also have bone conduction headphones, which work by, it's just technology that presses against your temples, and it's not broadcasting sound out through like a typical speaker system, but the sound waves are traveling through your skull or your bone. It's not super high fidelity sound, but it does allow you to listen to whatever you're listening to on your headphones without interfering with what you're hearing from the outside world, because your ear canal is not blocked. So those are actually available on Amazon for like $100 if you want to make a phone call while you're, you know, exercising. The fidelity of the sound for that should improve over time, because I think it's kind of mono sound right now. But yeah, you can play music through your skull if you really want to. Well, A lot of people call it the bone phone, but it's just bone conduction headphones or bone conduction headset. I forget the main company that does it, but if you just go on Amazon and look at bone conduction headphones, you can find something like that that is like, you can have it shipped to your house in 2 days. And so other parts of the body, like the Pipboy, I really liked how with one of the editions of Fallout, they gave you a shell that you could put your smartphone in because they knew that the technology was already there. It's just whatever decorative shell is on the outside. But like, we can put our smartphone all kinds of places, on a holster on your belt if you're really cool, on your arm, on your leg. You could 3D print a mount, or you could just duct tape it to your face. You could do whatever you want with it, honestly. And then things like the long fall boots and Portal, some car companies or like manufacturing companies are experimenting with exoskeletons. So the military and then hard industry manufacturing is exploring these exoskeletons that's like a suit you can kind of put on, and it will help assist with things like lifting or support. So we can augment human capabilities with this thing that you kind of step into. Right now they're a little bit rigid, but they do the job of like if you need to pick up a car on the assembly line, it'll help you do that. Or if you're standing up for like 12 hours at a time to help support your legs so they're not doing the work the whole time. Augmented reality is something that's been pervasive in gaming since we've had games. Any kind of user interface that you have, once we got into visuals, like all of that is a lot of that is overlaid or situated in the game world because it gives us cues as players. So there's kind of 2 flavors of augmented reality that happen in games. There's displayed over the environment. So like Overwatch, you can see there's highlights over different characters that are situated in the environment. Or displayed over the environment, so like they're overlaid on that, or you have like your tools in the bottom right, your statistics, like those are things that are kind of like in your window as you're moving around. And the same thing with like the Metroid Prime series, like Samus's visor helmet, which I think is a really cool example of technology because it's also diegetic. Like this makes sense that she would be seeing this in addition to the player because this is a tool that's like part of the Varia suit. So those are things that are overlaid, but then we also have things that are placed in the environment. So that's, I messed up, that was actually the highlight of characters in Overwatch. But like with Borderlands, whenever there's drops, these kind of beacon signs come up afterwards. Or in Breath of the Wild, you can see, like, when you use stasis, what direction things are going. Like, that's situated on whatever object it is, as well as the highlight of that object. Like, that boulder is the thing that is selected and it is in the world. And if you walk around it, you can see that it's still selected. And that's, like, augmented reality is used because primarily of queuing for players, because if you're thrown into a world that's completely fabricated, you're bringing in your own mental model of how that world should work, which is not always the case. That was something that is difficult with some point-and-click games like Grim Fandango. It took a very long time to figure out that you can use the hole punch on the desk because it looks like it's just a background thing that's painted in there. So like, what are some ways that you could indicate that something is clickable or usable? A lot of times, like, it would be an arrow on your computer changing to like a hand, but there's other ways we can do that too that are more subtle or congruous with the environment. Like Super Mario Odyssey does a great job with this because of course it makes sense for like tanks and animals to have hats because that means that you can knock that hat off and put your hat on it. So this poor guy is the only guy in New Donk City that is not wearing a hat, which means, oh, I should put a hat on that sucker. So augmented reality is really useful for queuing, and that's why it's been used in gaming for so long, is because it conveys this important information for players to actively engage with the environment. But there are clever ways that you can make it diegetic. AI and personal assistants are always a fun topic. So sometimes an intelligent or a personified agent, usually in the form of technology, sometimes in the form of, fairies, is employed to convey game world concepts, but in a diegetic or situated manner. So they can be tools like targeting, like Navi was kind of the diegetic explanation for why Link can target on enemies, because that was kind of the first time that they did that in a Zelda game. Sources of information, so like tutorials, insightful people or occupants of the world. They can be plot devices, like the fact that Edie can situate the ship so you can go fight the collectors. That's a plot device. Or world building elements as characters or props. Like that's part of what makes Portal such a special game is, could you imagine playing that game without GLaDOS talking to you? It would be a totally different game. It wouldn't be as engaging. So what can we take from personal assistants in games and apply to real-world voice assistants? Because we do have things like the Dot and the Echo and the Google Home, and it's funny to see people yelling at them, or like my boss's daughter has figured out that it is not sensitive to which user is using it, so she can add all kinds of weird stuff to their shopping list. Game worlds can act as these like test beds where it's like, okay, let's say we did have a virtual assistant. Like, what was really good about Edie and what was not very helpful? What is it about Navi that helped us in that period, but what are some things that just made us, like, why did we yell at her to shut up so many times? Yeah, exactly. So, like, a lot of that is unsolicited, or it's like, it's not very cognizant of the context. So those are kind of like thought experiment things we can think about when designing virtual assistants is like, well, if we put them in games, like, what are some things we like and don't like about them? Because in a game, we can have virtual assistants do a lot more than we can in the real world right now. Like, you can't do targeting and stuff very easily in the real world with Alexa. But we can in these game worlds, so we can say, okay, how do we get from here to there? What are some considerations that we need to do to make that happen, but in a way that we want to, instead of bowing to our robot overlords, unless that's what we want. And then volumetric projection and telepresence is another aspect. So this is a common tech trope in sci-fi games, but how would it work in real life? Like, let's say you wanted a Skype call somebody on the other side of the world. Like right now, if you Skype call somebody, you're not making direct eye contact with them, and doesn't that feel kind of weird that you're not looking people in the eye when you're talking to them? That's something that, like, we're trying to embed cameras in the back of screens, so then you are looking at the person when you are having a conversation with them, because that's our normal mode of having a conversation, instead of like, I'm talking to you guys on this panel, and as far as I can tell, I can see you, but you can't see me, kind of thing. So what are some considerations with that, as well as like scaling? So Star Wars does this as well, like Obi-Wan, you're my only hope, but like, what does that look like to her? Or Cortana, like Cortana probably only sees Master Chief's really big helmet head here, just because of the scaling of she's tiny in comparison to him. Like, it's great for him that it's handheld, but for her, like, what is her experience? Is it just like this? Or like the council with Mass Effect is so fun to hang up on them. I love it. But they can't really walk around the room, and you kind of have to just stand there in place. What if Shepard moves over to the left or to the right a little bit, or wants to kind of come up to one of them? Is there just like one hot spot where she's being read or scanned so that she just kind of like wanders out of frame, or is like half of her body is being projected to them and half is not? Like, what is that like for people on both ends of that teleconversation? Like, and how do we design technology that thinks about that so we avoid something like 10 years of Skype calls that are like this, where everybody's looking at their shoes? And then prosthetics, cybernetics, those kind of body augmentations. 3D printing has totally changed the game on this because it's made things customizable for all kinds of body parts and body measurements and for uses. Like this hand can like articulate. It can't do a ton, but that's better than, you know, a pirate with a hook hand. A hook is very useful, but is not great for hugs. Or like Deus Ex is a really good representation of this because it's so integral to the world that they've built in that game. Like prosthetics and augmentations are a normal part of life in that game world. But that also means that different ethical considerations are brought up, and it kind of makes you think about, all right, what are the ways that we can progress with these kind of technologies, or what does that mean for sports? What does that mean for healthcare? What does that mean for employment if people have different body augmentations? So game designers like to think about these things in the context of the game world, but it really acts as a good way for us to think about it too, because like it is up and coming, but what are the things that we do and don't want technology to do or to look like? Like sci-fi is just really good at exploring the hopes, the challenges, and fears of technology. Let's see. Oh, that is a fudge slide. So just looking at an example of some different ways to break things down. So I'm using this Breath of the Wild example. So on the top is a screenshot, but the bottom kind of outlined some different objects of interest. So like these criteria, like contextualization, like how is the presence of augmented reality explained in the world of Breath of the Wild? Is AR part of the lore of the world? Like, is only Link aware of it? Are other characters aware of it? Like, can the horse see if something is like glowing on the Sheikah slate? Or is it only known to the player? I mean, from a personal perspective, I'm assuming that Link can see these augmentations, but I don't know if like Impa can see them. So, and then info type, what kind of information is being displayed or conveyed and in what form? So like, what is the purpose of the augmentations for the Sheikah slate? For something like stasis, it's to let you know of what object you have selected, what direction you are applying force, and with how much force. And those are just, you know, the base things you need to be able to use this thing for all kinds of weird applications. Level of detail, how complex are the augmentations and the information they convey? Like this is relatively simple, but it conveys a lot of information. Are multiple levels of detail available on demand? Like could Link pull up the numbers for how much force and like for wind direction on shooting this rock across Hyrule Field? Level of abstraction, how literal or abstract are the augmentations compared to the information they present? What's the level of realism or plausibility? Like, if we have AR in here, does it look like it's a natural part of the environment? Like, you notice that items glitter if they're interactable in the world, but that's kind of plausible that that would happen. Like, those are really luscious apples, and like, the morning dew can like, or if it's, you know, really bright out, you know, the sun could be reflecting off of something like that to draw your attention. Or thematic integration with the environment. Are augmentations designed to be cohesive with the overarching contextual theme, or are they thematically separate? Like the Sheikah slate makes sense in this context because they've made it make sense that it is this ancient technology that can, you know, magic explains it, but I mean, we don't doubt it, it makes sense. We don't really guess like, oh, well, the Sheikah aren't some kind of, you know, whatever. It's like, no, like that makes sense for the world that we're operating in, that this piece of technology would exist and would look like this. And then temporal conditions, like in this case, do augmentations, like, do they last forever as long as you're looking at them? Are they conditional based on criteria? Like for stasis, your augmentations are only available for as long as stasis is active. And you can prolong that with an upgrade later, but you're not always looking at the world through the stasis overlays. So that will disappear when you're not using, it's conditional on whether or not you're using stasis and whether the timer has been used up for that point. But also, like if you turn away from the stasis object, it's like if a tree falls in a forest, doesn't make a sound, is it still activating that augmentation if you turn away from it and come back? I should try that later. And then spatial conditions, like that kind of gets into that. Like if you turn away from it, does it still exist? Is it still sitting there waiting for you to come back? Are augmentations dependent on criteria like viewing distance, proximity to objects, or other augmentations? Like viewing distance is obviously a thing, because like if I sent that rock shooting far enough that I just couldn't see it, at what point would it not show anything? Like, or like how far can you see something that's magnetic in this world? Like you can see a chest from a decent amount of, you know, distance, but if you're over on the other side of the world, I don't think I can see, like if I turn on the magnet feature, I don't think I can see every little thing that I can interact with over there. And then exclusivity. So like, are augmentations only accessible to a given user, which in this case is the player and Link, or can it be accessed by others in the space? Can somebody else with a Sheikah slate walk up and say, no, 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 I want this boulder to go in this direction? Or, oh, I see you're holding up that magnet, like I see you're sitting on that piece of ice that you made pop up, I'm gonna break that just to be a jerk. Like, is this technology exclusive to just the one user? Or like, if other people were walking around with Sheikah slates, what would that be like? If everybody had Google Glass, what would it be like? If everybody had a smartphone, what would our dinner conversations be like? So these are kind of the ideas that like I went through that example with, but we can, like this is just a framework that we can think about, you know, the different mechanics and technologies that are in our game worlds and think about it from an HCI perspective and say like, how does it belong to that world? Or what is it like to use that? Or what are some of the considerations and limitations and capabilities that we need to think about when we're designing these things like for game worlds so they can be an engaging experience for users, but also if we like see their parallels in the real world, like what are some ways that we want our technology to be? What are some ways that we can like figure out what we want before, you know, it's kind of decided for us kind of thing. So I figured what we could do now is I went through that example with Breath of the Wild, but let's talk about some of the game technologies that you guys like. And maybe we can talk about some of these different ideas of like how they fit into the game world, but also what are some things that we would need to consider, like if we were bringing them into the real world, like what would it be like what are some things to think about if you had a Pipboy in the real world instead of just in Fallout kind of thing. So I've got, I think, a microphone over there, but we can like, I mean, we can even like sit down closer if you want and like have this conversation, but I was gonna come down at this point and come creep on you guys. So, yeah. So we can pull up any of this, but at this point I figured we could just kind of sit and have a conversation about like, what are some technologies and games that you guys like?
And like Horizon Zero Dawn, there's the, I haven't played the full game yet, but I know this part of like the main character, like at the beginning of the game, discovers a headpiece that sort of gives her like the ability to see. It definitely augments the world because it like allows her to see, I think, things to interact with. She can see like, and I think they kind of integrated a lot where she kind of like sees. And then she can see like the movement patterns of like creature that she has to still pass.
Yeah, so that's a really good example of augmented or mixed reality. So like, what is the contextual, like what's the explanation for why that helmet is there?
I think it's like an ancient tech that she found.
So that makes sense for the game world that it's in and that she would be able to use it. It's not just like, aliens came at some point and there was a monolith and this thing happened, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So how about, so you were talking a little bit about the information type. Yeah, so what kinds of information does that, I guess, with some kind of creatures that go around?
She can see, I think, like, I think it allows her to see, like, it does a little bit of, like, targeting. So I think it kind of is trying to integrate, like, some player elements with the actual story.
Okay.
So she kind of, like, it's...
Well, that's going to be because it also ties into, like, it's not just a user experience, but it ties into a narrative element.
Yeah.
Like, it's multi-purpose.
Right.
In that way. It gives meaning to the information in the world that you're in. How about, like, is there a limit on how long it lasts? Any of the augmentations?
I don't believe so. I think you can like, toggle it on and off. I think the thing is, if you toggle it on, it's either really slower or you can't. I think it impedes movement. But I don't know if that's if that's actually happening in the real world or if it's just like a limitation to like, so that you're not like, always able to use it as a player.
Yeah, so that's where, like, you know, if it's a game mechanic, it's like they purposely added limitations to it.
Right.
Or if, like, let's say it's an early version of something like that in the real world and just the capabilities, like, these things would be $50,000 a piece if they worked with, like, perfect congruity versus something like that. So that's really interesting. That's a cool piece of tech. I haven't played Horizon Zero Dawn, but it's on my list because of, like, cool stuff like that. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of, like, talk about with any of that, or?
No, not really. This is, like, I also haven't played through a whole lot of it. I also just went kind of through the tutorial, but it was just, like, really interesting. Like, this is reminding me of, like, how, especially with, like, the integration into the narrative, like, I found that really interesting.
Well, tutorials are also a really good way to showcase your, like, that's your introduction to, like, we are building the mental model of how this world works for the rest of the game that you're playing, because this is your introduction to what you can and cannot do. This is your place to play around with that and to introduce these concepts that are not, like, they're somewhat familiar because we can imagine that kind of technology, but also they're new, so it's like, it's up to the designers to say, how can we bridge that experience so that it makes sense?
Get the user to construct their own mental model.
Exactly. So then if later in the game you can figure out ways to use it, that, like, there may be some hints of, like, you can discover a secret thing if you think of using this item here, kind of thing. And that's really rewarding. It's really cool. Awesome. Thank you. Is anybody? Yes?
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. I think Horizon Zero Dawn is pretty interesting in that way because the premise is, you know, there's the ancient technology that's left over from civilization, but then it results in these robotic creatures that are roaming the lands, and the hunter-gatherer society that you're a part of has no idea what any of them are about. So when you find the little thing that gives you the augmentation, it completely changes your entire reality because you can see the paths of these robots, and you understand that they're predictable, and that someone created them before you, and it just completely changes the entire perception from your origins as part of this primitive tribe.
Yeah, that's like, it's like the invention of the automobile or the telegraph. Totally revolutionized what world was like. Like, if that game persisted over a couple more years, like, how would that change the entire culture of the people that are using it? Like, how long would it take for them to get up to that, like, to be using technology at that degree that the previous people were? But then what was it, like, was it something with the technology that caused that, you know, cycle to go around again? Those are really big meta questions. But it's really cool that it's like, yeah, it totally changes your worldview. Like, smartphones are also, they've changed everything. They're one of the big, like, having a discussion earlier about, like, how TV revolutionized, like, culture in the world. Like, I was watching an episode of Leave It to Beaver with my aunt over Christmas, and the older son is asking, like, well, what did people do before they watched TV? Oh, they went to the library, and they read books, and they went to museums. So they just goofed off then. It's like, it totally changes, like, your idea of the world. Like, I mean, I grew up with a desktop computer, but like, I mean, my grandpa, I'm really proud of my grandpa for using a smartphone. Like, I can't imagine when I'm like 80 years old and streaming on Twitch Live, you know, Skyrim, because I'm still going to be playing Skyrim when I'm 80. Like, if people are coming in and like popping in on like the Jedi audience and like showing me things, and it's like, I can't get it to work, help me or something. Anyways, I digress. Did somebody else have something else that they want? Yes.
Cameras.
Yes! Oh my god, cameras.
Not first, second, and third person. I'm talking about the actual like camera that they use. Like Final Fantasy 15.
Mm-hmm.
Pronto. I like how you get to take pictures and like later on it involves the character lore-wise.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to spoil it if anyone hasn't played it.
Yeah. No, thank you for your consideration. That's another thing. Like, if there are spoilers, tell people when to plug their ears. Because there are earplugs available outside the concert hall. Yes. Yes! So, protect your ears when you go to a concert. Yes. Sans spoilers, what can you tell us about that?
I really think, I don't know, just really like the like in Spider-Man also, like get to use the camera.
Well, Spider-Man, that's like part of the character of who he is.
Yes.
Like, is Peter Parker as a photographer for Parker, give me pictures of Spider-Man! You know, kind of thing. So like, but it's also interesting looking at like, you know, use a camera in real life, but then how do you use a camera as a character? Like, there's another layer there because like your TV screen that you're playing this game on your console, but then you're using technology through that thing. It's turtles all the way down. But how do you design that? Like, what is it like? What are some things about the camera in the game that are familiar, like the camera that you have around your neck right now?
You can mess with the settings. Wow, I can't think of my vocabulary.
So like focus.
Yeah, focus. You can edit it. It's weird, but a little bit more advanced in the game because you can actually change the person's expression.
Oh, that's cool. Well, yeah.
I God of War.
I very much appreciate how a lot of these games, one of the first things they've done is selfies because they know I like to take screenshots.
Like in mid battle, you can change their like whole body language.
That's funny. Because photography is all about composition of the world. But like, if you're doing a focus, what is the controller scheme for like how do you focus it? Does it show like a rotator thing, or
it's like the augmented button.
So like, do you use the shoulder buttons or the stick to adjust your?
Depends on the game. Spider-Man, I haven't played much of, but you go to the settings and there's bars. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So like, but sliders is something that we've been trained to understand what sliders mean. So like, even if you don't have a camera and you're like turning it like this, you know, you can make that connection in your mind that like, oh, the slider is correlated with this physical thing of changing the aperture. That's really cool. Yeah, that's like a whole nother layer of stuff you can talk about as like multiple users of the technology, because like Peter Parker is using it and you are using it, and you both are seeing something different, but a couple of similar elements. That's awesome. Anybody else have something they'd like to talk about? Yes.
The Ocarina and Ocarina of Time. Really like the melodies you can play are it's like relatively simple, but as you're playing through the game, you realize that like it's a full-fledged instrument, and you can do more things with it. You can bend pitches and like do like those skills.
That is really cool. Like, people have figured out how to play full songs, or like, I would love a plugin that would be like for a smart home system where I could use something like that to like adjust the lights, like play the sun song and like turn on my lights in the morning or something like that. That would be really cool for smart home applications. But yeah, it's like something that is seemingly simple and has 6 buttons and maybe a pitch flanger can do so much. It just shows how much you can do with like a small affordance. A seemingly small affordance can do so much. That's awesome. Anybody else wanna? Yes.
Okay. So I feel like the Pipboy is an interesting thing to talk about because there's an unclear relationship between the context in which it presents information in game and how that actually exists in the reality. For example, you can work with your inventory and health conditions and stuff with the Pipboy. But is that basically just like a note app where you have a list of the things you're carrying with you and you're just saying, this is what I'm looking at? Or is there some sort of like wormhole technology built into it? Because your character's not carrying around a huge knapsack. So how are you managing that through the technology? Similarly, with health applications, do you have like needles and stuff built into the Pipboy that inject drugs into your system to level you out? And do you have a map? Is that just like a paper map that you'd fold open, write stuff on, draw lines? Or does that imply that there's a GPS system that exists in this world that has survived the apocalypse? And then, so that kind of carries into different aspects, like does anyone else have access to that technology? Like, what would Steel, do they have that map? Can they mark things? So, it's interesting that it's just a cool piece of tech where basically all of it is possible in the real world, but what it actually means in the real world is unclear.
Yeah. Like, I think you do see other characters walking around with a Pipboy. You don't know what kind of technology they're sharing on it, or if you can Bluetooth sync with somebody else's Pipboy to like synchronize maps, or if you plot something on a map, but that'll share that with them. Or if somebody can hack your Pipboy and see where you have put stuff on your map. But yeah, it's interesting to think like the satellites are still okay after everything got turned to shite, but so, or if the Pipboy is like how self-sufficient is the Pipboy in performing those things. That's a really cool example. Anybody else have any? Yes.
So I actually have a non-video game example, but there's a cartoon that was airing about 10, 15 years ago called Lyoko.
Yes.
It's about these kids who wander into a supercomputer AI thing in the basement of a car factory in France. And so the thing is, the premise of the show is that this artificial intelligence is capable of augmenting reality itself in somewhat bad ways. Mm-hmm. It has some very non-correlated goals with our goals, so to speak. Mm-hmm. It's trying to destroy the world. So these kids, they go in and there's basically it's a full body download that virtualizes them into a virtual reality world that's embedded in the supercomputer. The way that they interact with this virtual world, there's no augmentation in their field of view or field of sense, aside from what they are capable of perceiving as natural. But the operator of the computer is capable of communicating to them as if by word of God. And the operator has a two-dimensional, desktop computer interface that they can interact with, mouse and keyboard. The operator communicates to these people what they can see and what they can't see. And that's part of it's really a non-trivial premise as far as human-computer interactions in most media, video games and TV included. But it's rather interesting that you have to rely on someone else who has a field of view that you don't and communicate with them. Bringing this into the video games they made after the TV show, they made a couple of like Quest for Infinity was one of them. These video games give you the full field of view that the operator would, but you're playing as the player. So you have to think, at what point does the player perceive the information that you're seeing?
Yeah, so like Jeremy is sitting behind the computer and he can see everybody's stats But everybody who's walking around in this virtual world sees it like they do the real world. They are not, like, the supercomputer is keeping them from, like, seeing their stats of their health bars or their inventory or anything like that. It's interesting. You have to rely
Like Jeremy
on
has to tell
communication
a
with somebody
human,
else.
you're running low on health, get away from that. And then what can she do? She's got to listen to Jeremy, or she'll get devirtualized, die in the virtual world.
Yeah, it's like the transportation of conscience. So like that could be a plot device or a limitation of the technology, especially if you have like an antagonizing agent supercomputer limiting what information you can see in that world because it's defining what that world is. That's cool, yeah. I haven't thought about Kozioka in a long time. Thank you for bringing it up because I love it. Yes?
I was actually gonna like bring up something similar because there's a game called Natural Selection 2, which kind of merges in like, it's a team game, but most of the players that are in the game are kind of in an FPS setting where they're shooting around and like shooting aliens. But one person kind of controls it from a RTS setting where they see an overlay of the whole map, but they don't control like the actual characters, but they can like place where buildings may go or like direct the players around over a map that they see, but they can't really like control the characters obviously. So it's, I think it would be very similar to like the Kozioka example that you gave, where like it's kind of a, I wouldn't say like more realistic, but like a more plausible explanation where like you have one person at like a command terminal where in the game there's like a terminal that kind of goes over the character player and then I would assume what's happening is inside that terminal is you see that whole overlay of the map and then like I would guess whatever the players see of their like overlay of what buildings can build.
Well, that's a really big consideration when building technology that conveys information because information is power. And how do you allocate, like, does everybody have access to the same kinds of information or just the information that's particular to them or whatever their role is? So, like, yeah, is that a constraint of the system where it can only display all these sophisticated readings for one person who then has to convey to other people old-fashioned way? Or is that something where like people can, like the people inside of like the world of Lyoko may choose not to have all their bars up so they can just focus on the task at hand. Like that's a customization or a personalization kind of thing. So like, yeah, when like, and then also how much of the information or the burden of task, how much of that is given to the people who are using it versus the computer, because humans are really good at doing some things and computers are really good at doing some things. And ideally a system would leverage like the people are really good at picking out things or making decisions, whereas the computer is really good at crunching numbers or really, really good at processing this stuff or providing information. So like that's another consideration is like what is the task allocation or where do you place the burden of doing different things or the responsibility of getting the task done in that kind of way. So yeah, that's like, I mean, this all opens up a whole other can of worms. And like, I would love to sit and talk about this forever, but I think it's almost 11 o'clock. I will stick around and anybody who else wants to stick around, I don't think there's another panel till 11:30. But in the meantime, like, I've really woken up from this discussion and it's been really cool. But like, thank you so much for coming on this early morning and feel free to, if you would like slides, I can send them. I have my information up here. I have my Switch with me at MAGFest if anybody wants to play Monster Hunter. But otherwise, thank you so much for being here so early and like, this has been a really invigorating conversation. So thank you so much for being here and enjoy the rest of your MAGFest.